Welcome to the 3030 Health Podcast. The following discussion is for education and entertainment. It is not intended to diagnose or treat disease. Please do not apply any of this information without first discussing it with your doctor. Here is your host, Guillermo Ruiz.
Hello everyone. Today's podcast features two of my best friends in the paleo community, Allyson Chrystal and Dr. Blaidsdell. Allyson Chrystal is an occupational therapist and clinical instructor specializing in pediatrics. In her clinical work and research, Allyson has focused on sensory integration and self-regulation in children with behavioral and developmental disorders. Allyson is also currently completing a master's degree in functional medicine and clinical nutrition. Also in this podcast is Dr. Blaidsdell. After receiving his BA and MA in Biological Anthropology, Dr. Blaisdell realized that animal cognition was even more interesting than dead humans. So he trekked on over to SUNY Binghamton for his Ph.D. in experimental psychology with Dr. Ralph Miller, where he studied learning, memory, and cognition in the rat. This was followed by a brief stint as an NRSA postdoctoral fellow with Dr. Robert Cook, an expert in avian visual cognition at Tufts University, where he learned how pigeons perceive and think about the world, and how to tell one end of the pigeon from the other. In 2001, Dr. Blaisdell emigrated to the climatological and cultural paradise of sunny LA, where he has remained ever since. Dr. Blaisdell is a professor in learning and behavioral neuroscience in the UCLA Psychology Department. He presides over the Comparative Cognition Lab, studying cognitive processes in rats, pigeons, mice, hermit crabs, and humans. We recorded this podcast a couple of months ago. Since then, we have learned that the Ancestral Health Symposium will be hosted in Seattle, Washington. I will be presenting alongside both Dr. Blaisdell and Allyson Chrystal. So for more information, check out my website, that's 3030strong.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your family and friends. Leave me a review on iTunes or a comment. I will be sure to reply. Thank you and enjoy the show. Hello everyone and welcome to the show. I'm here with one of my dearest friends, Allyson Chrystal, and one really cool guy, Blaisdell. And guys, thanks for giving me this interview. Aaron, let's start with, how did you get involved with the Ancestral Health Society, or how did you got into this paleo movement?
There's a long answer and a short answer. I'll give you the short answer. and also, Guillermo, thanks for inviting me on this show. It's great to be here with you and Allyson. So the short story basically is that I was collaborating with a good friend of mine on some pigeon research. His name is Seth Roberts. He passed away a few years ago, unfortunately. But he, in addition to being kind of in learning theory, my area of research, was also very interested in self-experimentation and also in kind of that kind of alternative quasi-academic field where people like Gary Taubes inhabit that field, kind of pushing the barriers on what we commonly think of as common wisdom. And so I actually would read Seth's blog and just read an interview with Gary Taubes, and I thought, that sounds really cool. I'm going to get his book, read it. I was fascinated, and his book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, was basically saying the demonization of saturated fat was kind of misguided. And so, whereas refined carbohydrates especially seem to be really implicated for chronic diseases like obesity and many other things. So I was like, wow, that sounds really cool. I'm going to try that out. So I tried out a very low-carb diet, and I really started feeling a lot better, including my mental clarity and cognition. And then through Seth's blog, I also discovered kind of paleo diet type people like Mark Sisson of Mark's Daily Apple and Rob Wolf and people like that. And so I started reading those blogs too, and I really started just implementing the kind of things I was hearing about into my daily life, about especially with nutrition, trying to eat more whole foods and cutting out all the kind of refined processed foods, but also even trying to get my sleep better and being outside in the sun more and things like that. And really what the surprising thing was for me was not only was I feeling better mentally and physically, making this kind of transformation to the paleo diet, more lifestyle, but it also, about a year in, so I started in 2007, 2008, right around then. About a year or so into it, I was outside for the full day in short sleeve shirt, and I actually have a genetic disorder called erythropoietic protoporphyria, which we call EPP for short because it's much easier to say. So what it is a metabolic disorder that causes people who have it to be very sensitive to sunlight, and it manifests as like really burning skin when you're exposed to direct sunlight for a length of time, like for 20 minutes or 30 minutes, an hour, or something like that. Well, I've had it all my life. My mom has it, runs in the family. I was out all day that day, back in around 2009, and I got a sunburn. I didn't have any manifestation of the EPP at all. It was like it was gone. And to the point where I was actually out long enough to get a sunburn, which is something I haven't experienced since I was like a kid. And I discovered over a number of tests after that that really the EPP went into complete remission. And the only thing I could think that really dramatically changed my life was my diet. And so I thought, well, this is amazing. That's got me hooked. And so I started going to conferences on the campus of UCLA. I'm a professor in psychology at UCLA, and started going to different conferences that had to do with kind of ideas about physiology that lent themselves to kind of practical points of lifestyle changes. But all the talks would end with, oh, now we know something more, that we can look for a drug to treat it. And I was like, oh, face palm, right? Because like, no, but what your data suggests is that you could tweak your lifestyle in this way, and you actually, get rid of, you're addressing the root cause of an issue. And none of the people presenting on their research, and these are really, really well-funded NIH-funded scientists and stuff, none of them were linking it to lifestyle, as opposed to it's probably something wrong with the person, and we can find a way using a mouse model to discover the mechanism that we could come up with a pharmacological treatment. And that was their mindset. And I was really wanting to break out of that mindset. So I also met a friend of mine, Brent Pottinger, and who actually is the grandnephew of Francis Pottinger, I don't know if your audience knows who that is, but he's somebody who kind of discovered epigenetic mechanisms in research with cats, and that's affected by diet. I won't go into all that, but this is somebody who also blogs, and I got in touch with Brent Pottinger, and he joined me at one of these symposiums, and we were sitting there saying, oh my God, this person should have just realized the link to between the chronic disease they're studying and the mechanism and lifestyle. And we turned to each other and said, we should just have our own symposium where that's the focus, is lifestyle treatments to address the cause, and like paleo diet, that kind of stuff. And so that's where the Ancestral Health Symposium, AHS, was born, was out of that conversation.
And included in that group was you and Brett Pottinger, and then Paul Jaminet is part of the founders?
He joined early on. The first event was really just Brent and me. And actually, a friend of ours, Chris Owen, who kind of was like a third wheel on the side of it, but he wasn't as closely involved. But the three of us, mostly it was Brent and me, that kind of founded the first and hosted the first conference, which was at UCLA.
So then years later, last year in 2016, I met Allyson at AHS, So Allyson, what's your hero story? How did you get into this crazy thing that we call paleo?
It's so cool to hear how all the paths have crossed. It's really kind of surreal. My journey was pretty circuitous and kind of continues to evolve. But I started in rehab, working in rehab, got interested in functional medicine, and that's what kind of led me there. But I think even decades ago, when I was a gung-ho pre-med college student, wanted to be the pediatrician and heal all the kids in the world, kind of a thing. And right before I started medical school, I had this kind of freak out that maybe this was not the right thing, and took a year or two and taught high school at a place. And my goal was to work as a paramedic at night and kind of ensure that medicine was what I wanted. And in the meantime, make a little extra money before school with teaching some of these kids at this tiny little private high school. And I think the combination of teaching kids in this private high school that all had some sort of atypical learning pattern, and that was my first experience to kids who didn't quite fit the mold as we expected. And then my experience at night as the paramedic really kind of undid my concept of medicine, because it felt very much like meet, greet, treat, repeat. And I just kept thinking to myself, there's got to be something more to that patient healing relationship than just those quick kind of traditionally allopathic interactions. So I started researching areas where I could find more of an allied health long-term relationship with patients, and found occupational therapy, which has been fantastic. And I've worked always in pediatrics between teaching and clinical practice. And I think in the last 16, 17 years of practice, I really have always felt like this is super cool, but like we're not addressing some big void. Like I just feel like I can't do everything that I need to do for these little tiny people. And I knew that there was something else that was missing in that traditional rehab model, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. And as great as the opportunities are in rehab to really make dramatic differences in people's lives, I still felt like there was not a 360-degree picture of kind of that evolution of dysfunction and then where to go from there. And it was in the last several years with my own cancer journey where I started kind of with that same mindset, like, okay, I'm learning some cool stuff, but there's got to be something more. This can't just be this linear, surgery, radiation kind of a thing. And that's when I found functional medicine. And I think there's lots of us that have come into this movement, whether it be, naturopathic medicine or the paleo movement or functional medicine, in ancestral health, or research, absolutely, that all kind of have, even as Aaron just mentioned, kind of a personal stake in the game, that can serve as that motivator to really want to delve in even deeper. Found functional medicine, started a master's in that in clinical nutrition, and through my program there, started learning a little bit more about the ancestral health piece. And my first exposure to the ancestral health movement was a few years ago going to New Zealand for their international conference. And I spent 3 days kind of just marinating in these brilliant, in these brilliant minds. And at the end of every day, it was like, I kind of wanted to give everyone around me a hug and be like, I found my tribe. You guys get it. We're all speaking the same language. So through there, I ended up finding AHS, Ancestral Health Society in the States, and connected with all of you guys. And it's a very similar feeling that we're all in it to kind of learn and grow and evolve, but also disseminate information so that we can really help more people with the information that we can share.
Okay, so let's start, let's start talking about this in a very macroscopic level, okay? And let's start with the concept of mismatch or the concept of maladaptation. Aaron, could you tell our listeners, how having, like for porphyria, how changing your diet can change a genetic predisposition, and whatever your genetics are is not what's written in stone. It's going to be epigenetically exposed.
Right. Now, actually, in terms of the porphyria, it's an autosomal dominant single point mutation on one of the chromosomes, meaning that instead of the base pair has one type of thing, a G instead of a C, somewhere in the coding sequence. I don't know exactly what is, but what that means is it's something that's hard coded in the gene. So I actually don't understand how that could have changed through diet, but obviously the implication that because it has changed with just lifestyle intervention, the implication is there must be some epigenetic factor that is modulating the expression of that disease susceptibility, right? That genetic susceptibility. So the way I like to think of epigenetics, so what epigenetics are like little tags that sit above the genome, and they'll either make a particular gene more likely to express its protein or less likely to express its protein. So that's basically what it does. And my favorite model I've come up with to think about that is, if you have a cookbook, then imagine that same cookbook in 100 different kitchens, and there's a cook in each one of those 100 kitchens. Now they're using the cookbook and it has 100 recipes in it, let's say. But let's say that some of the pages in one of those kitchens, some of those pages got real sticky with dough and got stuck together and they don't open very easily. Well, that would be, in that kitchen, then they'd be less likely to express that recipe, if you get it. Whereas in another kitchen, that might be a heavily used recipe. Maybe it's got a crease in it so that when they open the book, it actually naturally opens that page. Well, in that other kitchen, that particular recipe will be more likely to be made and expressed into cooking. So that's kind of like there's the same cookbook, same set of genes, but the likelihood that any particular recipe will be expressed or not, or any particular gene will be expressed or not, depends on the kind of surrounding conditions above the level of the gene, the epigenome, or above the level of the recipe. That's the pages themselves.
That's the most brilliant description of epigenetics I have ever heard. I love that.
Epigenetics for dummies.
That's amazing. And now let's take it a step further. So now let's think as the cook, as the person who's making the food, and if that person is not well nourished, if that person is not eating, or if he's sleep deprived, maybe you have the perfect recipe book, but now you're gonna make a less than decent meal. So now your recipe is perfect, but now you're putting out bad food. So that's taking a step further.
That's true, because the epigenome itself, which resides above the gene, is itself within a nucleus, which is within a cell, which is within a tissue, which is within an organ, which is within a body, which is within an ecosystem of a society and everything, right? So at all of those levels, from the gene itself, from the base pair sequence itself, all the way up to society, those at every level, things can affect that health of that system.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, now do you want to take a crack at maladaptations?
Well, sure. That is naturally falls out of this idea, because now what you see is that thanks to Darwin and his discovery of this amazing process of evolution called natural selection, what happens is that organisms, populations of individuals that live in a particular environment, over generations will become adapted to that environment. The individuals that do best in that environment in terms of surviving and producing children, progeny, those individuals the genes that code for those good traits that make them really virile say, in that environment will pass on. So the environment's selecting for really individuals that fit well to it. Okay. Now, once the environment changes, or when the individual moves into a different environment, now those same adaptations might no longer, and those same changes might no longer be adaptive in that new environment or to an environment that's changed. And that is when now you might have a gene that works really well in your past environment, but makes you susceptible to some disease state or disease process in this new environment. That's when we would say that the person or their genes are maladapted to that new environment.
So now
that's the case with modern life.
So now let's put it out in like simple terms. So you are at a laboratory and you're doing experiments with monkeys. And this experiment might be about, maybe cancer cells or whatever, diabetes, it doesn't matter. And then that monkey is so stressed that he starts losing his hair. So then that's a maladaptation, because this monkey is supposed to be out in the jungles and where it's not stressed and it's not pulling his hair or picking his hair or losing his hair. But when you put him in this cage, we have a couple of options. We can shave the monkey, and then that's not a problem. We could tie the monkey down, and then it won't pick its hair. Or we can paste.
It won't like that.
Yeah, we can paste hair on that monkey and give it a toupee, and that's how we are tackling disease. We have all these different maladaptations, and instead of removing that maladaptation or taking the monkey out and putting it in the jungle so it can keep its hair, we're trying to come up, like you said, with a medicine or with an intervention in order to prevent that hair from falling, which is not fixing anything. And that's where Allyson comes into play. Tell us what an OT does.
My brain is going towards that maladaptation kind of conversation, because it relates so much to pediatrics. And when you mentioned, kind of forcing a monkey into a cage out of his natural environment, I think the end result of that is going to be kind of an outcome that looks very different than or not so different anyways than what we see kind of in different populations of kids, where we're taking kids out of very active environments and putting them into very still environments. So I'll table that for for the rest of our discussion. But OT basically, as an occupational therapist, it's a rehab science. And our goal is to help people overcome disease, disorder, dysfunction so that they can be functional in their daily activities. And so some of that might be with respect to, lots of different ages and stages of disease and dysfunction. But in pediatrics, really what I do is look at the roles of childhood, kind of what is important for a child to be doing. I'm a daughter, I'm a son, I'm a peer, I'm a player, I'm a student, I'm a community member. And when there is things that get in the way of the successful completion of those roles, that's where OT might intervene and try and look at what sort of supports and adaptations and remediations can we make to help that kiddo be more successful. So that's kind of the big generic picture of OT, at least in pediatrics.
But talk about how you can identify a maladaptation and the steps that you can do in order to fix that maladaptation and maybe make that person a little bit more functional for that environment.
Well, I think in rehab, we have two essential lines of thought. We have adaptation, or we have remediation. And remediation is the concept that I can fix physiologically or physically what the dysfunction is. I can compensate for motor movement and I can reteach motor movement after a stroke. I can remediate physiologically what the disorder is. In other cases, though, we have adaptation. And just like you mentioned, that's where we look at kind of the mismatch between the dysfunction and the environment, and we make modifications to the environment that can help the individual be successful in that environment. So a very basic, I guess, example might be a kiddo in a wheelchair that we would have to modify that educational or play-based environment or community environment to access all of the things that child needs to be successful in their roles.
Cool. So now, how can you apply this mismatch or, I guess what I'm getting to is why are we not letting kids play?
I know Erin's over there giggling too, because both of us just saw lights in our eyes.
Yeah.
I think, when I see dysfunction in kids, and I think I can say this in terms of we as practitioners, when we see disorder, disease, dysfunction in an individual, what we see initially or what comes to us initially is this behavior or the symptom or the sign that's kind of at the tip of the iceberg. And I think the majority of traditional practitioners would stay at the tip of the iceberg and treat what they see above that water level. But I feel like when we are, as folks who kind of look through the lens of ancestral health or functional medicine or more naturopathic medicine, I think we can look under the water level and see what has led up to that disease or dysfunction. I know Erin said root causes earlier. So in terms of how the mismatch applies to what dysfunction comes to me, I think when I see kids whose specifically I look at behavior, and when that behavior is not conducive to that environment, I start to kind of work backwards and question where's the root cause of what ultimately is the outcome of behavior that's maladaptive to their environment.
I like that, Allison. So what you're saying is that when you see a problem, let's say a problem behavior or something in a child, you're not saying, oh, what's the problem with that child? You're like,
Right.
wait a second, what's the problem with the situation?
Absolutely. And
It's reframing it.
Very much so. And I teach my graduate students this Venn diagram where it's 3 overlapping circles. And one is the child or the person, and one is the environment, and then one is the task. And so when when we make this statement or a parent tells me or a teacher tells me this kid can't sit still in his chair during the day at school, I can't just say that there's an issue with the kiddo. I have to look at those 3 things and I have to say, how is the task of sitting and learning and absorbing information, how is that maybe contributing to a negative outcome? Or look at the environment, his seat, his chair, the kids around him, the temperature, the school, the teacher, whatever. How is that contributing to dysfunction? And then oftentimes, finally, I will look at the child individually and what are the physiological things or intrinsic things, as you said earlier, Guillermo, that might be contributing to that dysfunction. So definitely the overlap of at least those 3 areas, I think, is essential.
And that's where we can talk about extrinsic things such as sitting all day and then you have a kid that has a tic or it's just fidgeting all day long. And then you can look at intrinsic things that are things such as nutritional status, lack of sleep, and all of these things that end up affecting learning.
Absolutely.
Not only affecting learning, they're affecting development. The whole maturation process, the whole development of the nervous system and the cognition and the intelligence and the curiosity and the playfulness that are the functions of that intelligence and are the manifestations of a healthy nervous system are being affected by these extrinsic and intrinsic situations that are maladaptive to the normal process by which children develop.
I read a paper on ADHD, attention deficit disorder, and it basically talked about reframing how we see ADHD and how there was this population and the kids that expressed symptoms. This I think it was a tribal population in Africa, and the kids that expressed ADHD like symptoms had higher BMIs than the kids that didn't. And the reason was because they were curious and they were out there, looking for food because, when you're a kid, that's what you want. And so it made them more resilient. And now, instead of trying to nurture this curiosity, we're trying to fit all these kids into this one box and dampening their curiosity, and now they're a problem child. When if we look at this evolutionarily, if we had the systems or a way to encourage this curiosity, maybe these kids could be expanding the boundaries of what we're trying to learn.
Absolutely. And I think the idea of exploration is one that is so crucial from a developmental perspective. And I know I would love to hear Aaron's thoughts on this, because I know he's talked and researched about this in terms of how it affects play, even from an evolutionary standpoint. But when we allow children in naturalistic environments to have kind of free reign of their exploration, so they are going to make mistakes and they're going to get feedback from their environment, and they're going to physically explore their environment in a very, very healthy way. They're going to psychologically explore their environment. They're going to emotionally. That realm of exploration really lays a framework for every aspect of development for a child, whether it's physical, physiological, emotional, psychological, cognitive, all of those things. And I think for me, the mismatch is between the freedom of exploration that was more intrinsic in our ancestors because it was ultimately a survival mechanism or something that they right, exactly, versus now where we tend to put kids in boxes, and even in infancy, exploration is within such a small, convenient area so that the babies are safe and parents have an eye on them or whatever. So even from a very young age, we're kind of muting that exploration, and I think that can really have detrimental effects ultimately on development.
I'll just riff off of what Allyson just said, because she's completely right. And the big mismatch is that as kids, and this is something I looked at the anthropological ethnographic literature on, and really it's a human universal condition among very traditional societies and hunter-gatherers and horticulturalists, I should say, really traditional peoples, where the children have this freedom. That's a key word. Freedom to explore, try things out, play, get into trouble. But they're plugged into this community of other children of mixed ages who are also there to push the boundaries, but also to help the older ones helping out the younger ones as they kind of get into trouble. And it's like the village raises a child. Well, that's kind of how it works in these traditional societies. And it's through that open-ended, self-motivated exploration, a lot of imitating other people that are trying things out, all that kind of stuff that's there in the child, in our ancestry, is there in the child right now. You look at any baby in a crib, any toddler in a walking around, looking around outside or out the window if they're not allowed to go outside, or any child in a park or sitting in a classroom. It's the same as in a hunter-gatherer or one of our ancestors from thousands of years ago. They have this intrinsic motivation and adaptation to explore, to play, to try things out, to get into trouble, and to do it in the context of their community. And now I think the big mismatch is that If you look at the modern educational system, there are three things they value the most: safety, conformity, and basically a measurable assessment. Right? What can we see that the child's doing, getting better from grade 1 to grade 2 to grade 3? And the reason we have that kind of system, the main reason, I think, and I talked about this in a paper I wrote a few years ago called Play and the Development of Human Intelligence. The main thing, I think, is that the modern educational system really got going in response to the Industrial Revolution and the need to have a trained workforce that could, after graduating high school, can go and do any kind of industrial kind of manufacturing or clerical job in wherever they need in society. And so they had to develop standards for learning to do math by algorithm, learning to do different processes all the same way, so that they would make sure that the workforce is trained. I mean, that was good for the society, I guess. I don't know how good the kids were going through that, but basically nowadays we're still stuck on that industrial model of like, okay, everybody has to learn to do this. Everybody has to, and there's common standards, a common core, common set of principles, and everybody's got to go through it at the same rate, at the same time, and reach certain milestones at the same rate, at the same time. But that's not how children grow. Nervous systems grow, development grows non-linearly. There'll be long periods of stasis, and all of a sudden a jump. And even just the way daily activities are arranged is really, freedom is non-linear, it's chaotic. That's how systems learn the best. But with this enforced kind of entrainment of a always going through algorithm type processes, everybody's held to the same standards, and everybody's sitting all day. That's antithetical to the natural way that our evolved psychology, the adaptation to learn and develop, that's antithetical to letting those adaptations do their normal job. And so that's the big mismatch.
I have two things that I gotta say, and like my mind is racing right now. Okay, first, number one is consequence. So you have, you said it, a couple of times, kids getting in trouble. If your kid is not getting in trouble, could we be training these kids to think that there are no consequences to their actions? For example, you have these padded playgrounds. The kid, is not allowed to go outside. The kid never scrapes their knee. 17 years old, here's the car. So there's no consequence. They've never got it.
It's like stunted growth. It really, I think you're right. I think that's like stunted growth.
And then I hope I don't lose any followers by saying this, but you have video games and where you're constantly just respawning after falling off a cliff. Now you're training your kids that maybe it's not so bad to fall off a cliff. But, when you have peers...
I'll take issue with that one, though, Guillermo.
Oh, go ahead.
Because as a child, and even to this day, I mean, mostly as a child up through maybe grad school, I did play quite a few video games. I love video games. But you know what? And even Cops and Robbers, where I'm going around with a little pistol shooting at people, or Cowboys and Indians I played as a kid, right? I understood that was not reality.
Right.
Like, there was a clear distinction. It never would have crossed my mind that the fact that I'm shooting a toy gun at somebody means I could take a real gun and that would be okay. To me, those were like opposite islands across an ocean. I understood the dramatic difference there, and I presume that most children actually do understand those differences, including like what happens in a video game is a video game. Like what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Well, what happens in a video game, I think children understand that. What I would say, Guillermo, is that I think if all or the majority of your play and exploration, free time or whatever it's called, is spent only allowed to do that, then I do think that's a problem, because I think kids need to be physically three-dimensional real space active and exploring. In addition, I think some video games can be quite healthy accompaniment to a lifestyle growing up, but I don't think they should be the sole or primary source.
I think, that what scares me is how real they're getting and how immersive and how addictive they're becoming. That's what scares me. I grew up playing video games. Thankfully, I have such an addictive personality, and thankfully I get nauseous with 3D video games, so I can't play anymore. But that's what scares me about video games, is just how addictive and how rewarding they're becoming. Okay, second.
Can I just one quick tangent about that? One of the things that, at least from a parent and a therapeutic and a practitioner perspective, that when I treat kiddos, I don't treat kids for quote unquote video game disorder, but when I treat kiddos who find that that is their go-to, and that's what I hear the parents saying, or that's what the kid would tell me. Again, it's that iceberg thing where I look under the surface and go, okay, what is it about their outside of video game life that is driving them there? Is that the one place they can have social interaction that they feel has merit? Is that the one place they can feel successful from a visual motor perspective because, in school they're, it's not going well. So not at all trying to make a correlation that every kid who is addicted to video games has other things that are really crappy in their life. But I do find sometimes that it represents some things that might be missing in other places. And so I always at least try and be a little diagnostic when I find that that's really a popular pastime, and it's one that, parents always go to when they need something to take away as punishment or to give back as a reward or whatever, that maybe there's some underlying reasons why they are really pulled in that direction other than just the great marketing and the visuals and whatever. So just food for thought.
Okay, then the second thing that that for you, for both of you, is that this type of learning, this type of just lecturing at you, the way, the systematic, we're gonna all learn at the same time.
Directed instruction.
Yes, it's bottom up all the way to doctoral programs. At my school, we have some classes where there's a PowerPoint presentation and the professor's behind the podium and they're reading what's on the PowerPoint presentation, and you're expected to have, this higher level understanding of what's going on. Now, it really suits me. I can just sit there, listen to a person drone, and I have understanding of what's going on. And then but there's some people that have different learning styles. And I really thought that it puts people at a disadvantage, because now, if we have this mixed system of teaching, or how are we going to fix this so we can all learn at an institution? As in, this is getting pretty grim. You're telling us that, there's 3 things that need to be there for learning. And the reason this system is set up is to make factory workers. How can we get actionable things out of this podcast and start changing our communities? What should we do with our kids? What do we need to be talking about in education?
I think one maybe terse answer to that is it's such a big global question, and it's a lot to kind of bite off and try and process at once. So I think if I were to prioritize answers to that question, I would ask maybe your listeners who are parents or teachers or folks that work with children, or even in academia at an older level, where are things breaking down? So if we're going to pick our battles, where do we see that mismatch really rearing its ugly head in the most profound ways? And that's where we will start to kind of address some of those questions. So if I ask a teacher and she mentions that kids get wiggly and at this particular time of the day, everyone always fails tests, and then we zoom out and look at the fact that it was 5 minutes after lunch and no one has calmed down and we have wiggly bodies. So I think taking it from first, where do we see the biggest issue, and then kind of zoom out from there.
That's a good answer. And then I'll add to that with actually a similar kind of answer, but more at the kind of how would we restructure our educational system in that kind of way. And I think that another analogy I'll bring in is when you're to think of a developmental process, let's say from birth till adulthood. Okay, so the educational system, that's a developmental process. Imagine that you're an archer and you're standing 20 yards away from the target. You're holding your bow and arrow. You take aim and you pull back the string, and then you loose the arrow. If there's a little bit of error in your aim, then that error, as it gets closer and closer to the target, further and further from you, is going to be more and more off. So if you could have corrected the aim earlier on, or correct the trajectory earlier on, which is a smaller nudge of force, you'll be much more successful in getting the arrow closer to the target than later on. So that's kind of how developmental processes can work too. I think the biggest focus for correcting mismatch should probably be directed at early child education from preschool up through the elementary school ages, because you start by giving a really robust foundation like play-based preschools, which are starting to make become a little bit more prevalent. Play-based, more freedom and exploration, kind of letting the kids have more control over what they're going to do, when they do it, things like that. If we can do that in our society at the level of the preschool and early and like the elementary school age, I think the kids will be much better, much more ready for kind of a more directed instruction, like starting in 5th grade, middle school, and high school. There's not necessarily anything wrong with directed instruction for learning academic topics that are of intellectual interest, like deep mathematics and deep science, and the more expertise kind of stuff, literature. But I think that that children can do well, almost anybody can do well kind of on those types of subjects if they've had the earlier foundation of building in kind of with their own play-based exploration, the strong neural development, so that they're smart and critical thinkers. And to back this up, actually, the research from people in my field or another field related to mine of early childhood cognition, there are researchers at Berkeley and Stanford and Michigan State that are showing that children from babies on up through elementary school age initially start out thinking like scientists. You give them a toy that they don't know how it works, and you say, "Oh, look, this thing lights up." You could either show them how it lights up, or you can give it to them and let them figure it out. If you both groups of kids will learn how to make it light up, but the kids that learn how to make it light up on their own also discover lots of other things about it, and they're more robust at figuring out other toys too. Once they figured out one on their own, as opposed to the kids who are more directed to show how it operates, they don't really explore it that much, and then can't figure other similar toys out as quickly. Also, when they're trying to figure out how a toy works, they are actually doing like a controlled experiment. They only change one thing at a time. They go through this reason. I mean, it's like, and a colleague of mine wrote a book called The Scientist in the Crib. Yeah. So babies really kind of come to the world equipped to be like little scientists. And the idea is that during directed education, especially during the early, like elementary school age and preschool age, it's teaching that out of them. It's teaching them out of being exploratory, it's untraining them from being a scientist.
Inquiry, I think, is such a crucial skill, even at that, as you mentioned, that's a fascinating study, but such an infant age to have that natural kind of vetting for that inquiry, that exploration and the freedom to do that, and get the feedback from their environment that then redirects or directs them another way. But again, very self-directed.
It's like this want for answers is innate to us.
Essentially, it's like we're born with that ability, with that motivation, that drive. And I think we need to find a way to nurture it and harness it and allow it to express itself, so that kids will be ready to grasp the more intellectually deep concepts that will make them profound problem solvers and happy as adults.
Aaron, you have kids.
2 kids.
Okay, what are some things that are you doing differently with your kids, maybe since childhood? And Allyson, you have kids. What are some things that that we can maybe start thinking about and to set up our kids, to set up our future, to develop more scientists? Because this is just going to create a stronger, more robust tribe.
Right. Well, the first thing I do is try and suppress the urge to not let them help when they want to help, like in the kitchen. And like, if my daughter wants to crack an egg, I'm like, oh no, I'll get a nightmare. I have to suppress that and say, okay, you could do. We'll create a mess, but they're really interested in helping out in the kitchen. And now they can crack eggs like a pro. And my older daughter, who's 11 now, can. I hate to say this on a paleo podcast, but she can make pancakes herself. and yes, we're not at home. We're not entirely. I personally generally am, but not my whole family is entirely paleo, which is fine. And but they can do a lot more for themselves because they figured it out, because they were given the opportunity to make a mess. And the other things I do is that's kind of how I approach it. Obviously, they're in a public school. I can't afford to send them to one of these really nice, swanky, specialized schools that's really
like a charter school,
like one of those charter schools or something, and also. And I don't have the time. I'm busy, so I don't have the time to commute them all that way. And the other thing is actually I don't like the idea of commuting very far just so my kid can be at a better quality of those kind of play-based schools. If that means that when they come home, their friends are halfway across the city, like their friends who would be classmates are halfway across the city because they were also bused or whatever. And I like the fact that my kids are at a school that's a mile away from me, and they see their friends on the streets almost every day when we go out. I like that sense of community. So I've chosen to have them go to this public school here in Culver City, which is a city within LA. And yes, they have directed instruction. Yes, they have all the typical things. But when they're not in school, I really let them have as much time as I can to play, even some on the internet. In fact, my 11-year-old Maggie has really gotten into making little videos using pictures and video stuff with the phone, and so it's a lot of time on the phone, but she's doing this creative stuff. She's creating these little scenes with her sister and her friends, and then she even put a few of them on YouTube. You probably find them if you search for them, but like they're really clever and they're really cool, and I think great, and I think anything that she can do that, and my younger one too, sets up scenarios in the living room with dolls and everything. And it's kind of a nightmare for me, but it's just great for her. And she could spend hours setting up these scenarios where her dolls are going to be in this kind of story and everything. That's being a human, to playing, imagining. I try and encourage that and applaud that. That's the biggest thing.
Before you answer, Allyson, I want to say something really fast because I feel like I need to say this. I'm a product of public school. And imagine if all the Blaidsdell kids and all the Chrystal kids, and were taking off and put in specialized charter schools. What's going to happen to the other kids that can't afford it, or their parents don't know, or are fighting to get the kids a better education? Then our public schools are gonna go down. And we're creating a deeper problem. I love, Aaron, that your kids are going to public school, because that means that you are probably involved in PTA meetings at some level, and you're trying to change different things at the public level, for the whole society, not just for your little, family. So, that's pretty cool.
That's right. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, Allyson.
From a parenting perspective, right? I'm so impressed with what Aaron said about that, and I can really relate to that idea of the instinct to let kids explore and kind of anticipate what the consequences might be, but let them do it anyways. And when my kids were little, I think I kind of made the decision, and they'll tell you now that they're teens, that this is my kind of go-to motto of parenting, is that I really say yes and enable exploration as much as I can, unless it's either an issue. And my kids will tell you, I will intervene when it's something that has a serious safety potential consequence, or B, something that has to do with the way that they're treating other people. And beyond that, I really try and give as much freedom, and I direct and I mold, but try and kind of let that be my guide of kind of a cue for me of letting them have that exploration practice and the natural consequences that their environments are going to give them, and then guide them through how we learn from that. But I think the other thing, especially as they're getting older, one of the things that I think is crucial is that they are exposed to those same kind of opportunities that Aaron was talking about earlier, in terms of that very, very early infancy exploration. But even at 12 and 14, 13 and 16, I think it's really important that kids have the opportunity to learn new physical skills. So to take a class in something they've never done before, I think we're pegging kids to be the soccer player when they're 6, and they do that kind of linearly through high school. And I think our model of even structured play or sports for kids is very much like, find something you're good at and stick with it, because gosh darn it, you're going to get a scholarship. But yeah. I think the opportunity to be that awkward kid in a class, or that awkward person in a situation that's being taught a new skill, is such a crucial element, I think. And it's one that even as an adult, I have to really remind myself to jump into learning something new, whether it be a new sport or a new activity or something that puts me completely out of my comfort zone, and kind of revisit some of those very basic feelings of exploration and kind of that inquiry and that failure, but learning from it kind of a thing. So I think now at their ages, that's something that they would tell you that I'm really particular about, is that even if we're good at something, and even if we can do something all the time because we're good at it, we need to be comfortable with getting uncomfortable and learning something new.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Allison, that was awesome. I'm all, because that's me. I always push myself outside my comfort zone.
Yes.
And I tell exactly, that's how we learn, and that's how children learn, is by always saying, "Oh, I haven't done this before. Let me do this."
Right.
Right. That's how you learn, and that's how you get the thrills of life. And that's how you really grow from that. And all
Most
you're right,
definitely.
like shuttling everybody into down a path, a very narrowing path, is the opposite of what they should be doing.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
And I think I would rather have my children kind of under my wings while they're doing that. Just this past summer, my son, who's been the hockey goalie for years and years and travel teams and yada, 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 decided he wanted to play ice hockey. And he got off the ice after the first couple of days and in tears, my little manly guy, just in tears. He's like, "Mom, everybody else is so much better. I can't do this." And now, several months later, he's, not not the all-star, but his skills have come along so well, and he loves it. And I think me being able to guide him through those points of despair, and I'm going to quit, and I can't do this, and my body isn't working the way I want it to. I think, childhood is really the ultimate time to go through that, because he's learning skills now that he's going to need when he goes to his first job, or when he, participates in his first activity at college or whatever. So I think that exploration, that experiential learning, and being okay with doing something new and being not good at it is just a great foundation, I think, for everybody.
That's great. And, because I'm seeing an increase. I'm a college professor, so I'm seeing an increase over the past 15 years I've been teaching. And the number of kids who come into my classes who are not prepared for the basic social exchanges. So I'll illustrate with an example. Oh my gosh, this summer I was teaching a class. I'm not going to name any names, so I'm not going to out the student. But I was teaching a class, and I got an email from the student after the first day. So the first lecture, it was a big class, and there were seats in the aisles, but how people kind of sit on the edges first.
Yeah.
They don't always go right into the middle. And there were some people that came in a little bit, like a couple minutes late. And so I noticed they were sitting on the stairs instead of asking to go in or something. I said, okay, that's fine. People do what they want to do. But I got an email from a student who must have been one of those students who said, "Professor Blaidsdell, could you do a couple of things?" And the audacity of this is crazy. The first thing they said is, I come a little bit late because I'm coming from another job, and so I'm not able to get there right on time or a little bit early. So usually I'm about 5 minutes late, and so to the class, and by then the people are all sitting on the ends, and I couldn't get in. Could you make an announcement in class for people to move in, so that people can get in? Okay, I wanted to scream at this student, can't you ask yourself what is wrong with you? Have you studied development here? You have social anxiety, which a lot of them now do, actually.
Absolutely, yeah.
And the second thing she asked was, all right, well, there are a lot of females, so I won't give any details about the student. There's no way you'll ever find out who it was, so she's protected. Just want to say that. So the second thing she asked in the email is, and since because of my job, I don't get there within 5, sometimes 10 minutes late, could you not say anything important in class in the first 10 minutes?
Oh, wow.
Can you imagine the audacity of sending a professor sending an email like that to your professor? And this is probably one of the glaringly outlying incidents of this, most dramatic case. But I'm seeing a shift, especially in anxiety levels. So I've been an outside member on a couple of clinical psychology PhDs. So a PhD committee is made up of the advisor and then usually 2 or 3 other faculty. And so I'm not a clinical psychologist. I'm in the experimental psychology program, but I was on a couple of different clinical psychology PhDs. And they study, in this lab that they're in, they study anxiety disorders. They screen the UCLA undergrads that come in to do an experiment with them for a typical, DSM anxiety disorder, with the Diagnostic Statistical Manual.
Right.
And they told me that about 50% of the students, just normal undergrads that get screened from the little flyers hanging up in the hallways, about 50% of them reach clinical levels of diagnoses for certain anxiety disorders.
Wow.
And when I was in college in the late 80s, I mean, of course, there's always going to be anxiety disorder, but I don't think the prevalence was nearly that high.
No, and I'm seeing that, I would say, even exponentially in I have kindergarten patients right now who have been diagnosed with anxiety disorders. I have elementary kids, and it manifests in so many different ways. It can be that kind of heightened piece, or it can be that just complete withdrawal. And so I think, you're seeing the folks that I might see when they're a decade or so younger, but I think the origin is very similar. And it really speaks to what you mentioned earlier, where there's this mismatch of, I haven't developed the coping skills on how to be successful in my environment because I've never been put in a situation where I had to figure it out for myself, where I had to explore and get safe feedback from the environment that told me I should go about it another way. So there isn't that confidence in the ability to problem solve and to cope and to kind of action plan for what they need academically or even socially, because they were never in that position with being comfortable, being uncomfortable, kind of a thing.
Exactly.
So what do we do? So you have a kid, college age kid or a kindergartner. Should we just prescribe him some anti-anxiety medication?
Oh yeah, that works great.
Hey, it's funny, because we started the conversation saying, let's create a pharmaceutical, but now after all the stuff that we talked about, it's laughable. But guess what? Some kids are getting medicated.
Yeah, a lot.
A lot of them are getting medicated, absolutely. And that creates a whole other host of side effects and issues that then affect cognition and development and exploration and all those things we just mentioned. So I think if I'm speaking to parents, one of the things I say most often is really try and be the detective for your kids and look at behavior and look at socialization and look at emotional regulation and self-regulation as kind of clues in what underlying mechanisms might be at work that's creating that dysfunction. So I think, being a detective and looking at your kid's behavior and then figuring out, well, what is it about this behavior that needs a support, or how can I work with someone that really fills in the gaps for this kiddo so that we can get more on that path of kind of the natural maturation process, I think.
And why are people anxious? Why are these disorders developing so early and then manifesting even later? And it's because of the evolutionary mismatch. Kids are directed instruction. They have to sit in classrooms. They have to succeed. They have to achieve such milestones there's so many more now than even when I was a kid, that it's always a push, and this mismatch is fomenting these anxiety disorders. The UCLA, over 100,000 applications are received every year to let, I think, 8,000 to 10,000 students in. So you have a 1 in 10 or 1 in 15 shot at getting in. And you know what? These are the best of the best in terms of GPA. It's like a 4.8 on the scale of 0 to 4. Because there's all these like AP classes, they get extra, this, extra that. These are these high achievers in terms of all the extracurriculars they have had, all of the really excellent grades, the super high GRE scores because they've taken the practice. So they're really good at standardized tests. And this is the sample that we're pulling in. And what we were pulling in, we're breeding anxiety disorders. We're selecting for anxiety disorders and failure to think outside the box, to use a phrase I really don't like, but to be critical evaluators of information and decision making and problem solving and general purpose that way. We're selecting against that, and I think that what we really need to do is not just talk to the parents. That's obviously critically important, but there's got to be a way to talk to the system, whoever's in charge of however the system is designed to scale this back, to rethink the whole thing. I think that's really needs to happen at a societal level.
I have a question, Aaron. Do you think it would be counterproductive to call mom and say, hey, your adult child just asked me to not say anything important before the class starts?
It might make me feel better to say something like that. I don't know. I don't know if that's going to help. I think at that stage, I think it's just they're going to learn the hard knocks as they come.
I think so.
Absolutely. And Guillermo, I can speak to that a little bit with some of my not current, but former grad students, where I think there was that double-edged sword where if I involved the parent, this was then kind of contributing to this helicopter parenting thing. And when I had the time, I really found it more helpful to take the student aside and say, look, I have to tell you, my impression of this comment or this behavior or whatever it is really doesn't fit with how things need to work in this environment. And here's why. So kind of doing a little bit of the parenting, which obviously is not, not ideal in an academic environment, certainly. But I do think that we have on some level to be that feedback, whether it be in a parenting role, a educator role, a societal role, for sure.
And it's so big, this maladaptation or this mismatches from, having this very restrictive areas of learning where you have to sit down and you have to be looking at a PowerPoint presentation or a chalkboard, to the way that we're feeding our kids, to the way that we're moving, to the way that we're thinking. It is just such a huge problem, and I can see how it can be really daunting for a parent. But there are people out there trying to change it, and there are ways to maybe try to fit into this mold in a way that you're going to take advantage of all of these problems and maybe become better at education or become better at being a scientist. But you have to start somewhere. You have to start somewhere, and there are people out there that think like you, and there are people out there that are fighting the same battles. And if you're a student and you have anxiety, there are people out there like you, and it gets better. Just make sure you're talking to, maybe your counselors or maybe your friends. Try a different sport. Put yourself out there, and maybe you will get over this hump.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think awareness is the first huge step, and then finding the adequate supports would be kind of a close second. But at least acknowledgement is definitely a step in the right direction.
Yeah, and it's not a death sentence, these kind of things like, well, I have ADHD or I have anxiety disorders. I used to have almost a phobic level fear of public speaking. And oh my gosh, I had to overcome that, especially once I went to grad school and had to go and give professional talks at professional conferences and get up as a TA in front of a class and teach a section of 30 students. And I took it and I was okay, I'm going to conquer this. And within a semester, it was gone.
How do you do it?
Now I enjoy it. I don't know. I just kind of thought, whenever I approached something where I had to change myself, something that to overcome an obstacle, I always look at it as a challenge, and I look at it as something fun. I try and make it fun, and I just practiced, and then thought about, like, what are the things that are going well, and part of it is just doing. By doing it a few times, I saw it was enjoyable, and I felt a sense of accomplishment, and the fears just went away. Yeah. So I think that we can really change ourselves if we have the mindset to. If we have our own motivation to do something, if we have an anxiety disorder or something, we really do have our own motivation is the most powerful tool. And as a professor, I try and, when I identify a student who I'm working with certain, like I had a student that came to me and confessed that he had ADHD and that he had trouble with certain things, and I worked with that person, and they seemed so appreciative of that, and they did so well in the class. So sometimes just being there for somebody.
Most definitely.
What about you, Allyson? Any things that were daunting and then you overcame?
How much longer do we have in this podcast? That might be a long list. I think I couldn't agree more with Aaron that I feel like for some of us, it's to jump in with 2 feet. The water might be cold. I'm not going to go in one ankle at a time. I'm just going to jump in and deal with it and then be better on the other side of it. I think that's a great strategy for a lot of us. And especially when the outcome is a positive one, it just encourages us to be more proactive in that. But I think sometimes what's helpful is for me anyways, a couple of different things, is to get feedback from someone that I trust and that it's okay to be vulnerable with, right? So to be able to say, look, this is something I want to accomplish, and I'm really feeling this way about it, and I'm not feeling comfortable in my own skin. I need you to give me a little feedback and guide me in the right direction, because I know you know me, and I know I trust your advice or whatever. So I think sometimes that all or nothing approach is awesome, and I think sometimes kind of saddling up with someone that will be supportive and will give you the right kind of nudge might be helpful too.
I don't know if you guys noticed in the past hour and 14 minutes, I have an accent. I don't know if you guys noticed. But I remember I was at a party, and a college party, and this high schooler, comes over and she says to me, "You have the cutest Spanish accent," and it just completely disarmed me. Like I was so ashamed of having, and then. And this is like, first, college, first year of college, and you continue going through life and whatever. And it's always in the back of my head, and then I met my friend Devin, and he says, you shouldn't be ashamed of your accent, because if you have an accent, you might know more than one language. That frame shift, that changing that, this problem into, oh, you're right.
Right.
I have an advantage. It
right.
really changed, to the point that I can joke about it. But
and be out there doing podcasts and things where your voice represents you. That's amazing. Absolutely.
Yeah, but yeah, it's insane how, just like you said, having feedback from someone you trust.
Right.
That is just so powerful.
Most definitely.
And embracing what it is that makes you different. That is like, so I had an example over the winter break. I was in Hong Kong visiting my in-laws and the family. So my wife is from there. So we were all over there, and we were at the one of the museums in Hong Kong, a history museum, and we were looking at some old pictures of some of the early British people, white people that were first coming to Hong Kong, right? And my brother-in-law turns to me and says, you know what we call white people, right? It's kind of a derogatory term. I go, no, what? He goes, oh, white ghosts. There's a Chinese term that calls white people white ghosts. And it's like, because you don't want to be called a ghost in Hong Kong. In Asian society, ghosts are like spooky and not good things. But I thought that was so funny. And he only meant it in a harmless, jovial way.
Right.
I thought it was hilarious, and I embraced that. I'm like, hey, look, it's the white ghost. And, it's like you disarm any kind of anything that can make you different. That you can either turn it into something negative, or you can embrace it and say, this is cool, something I knew about me, I can identify with, that makes me stand out from other people. And just that ability, if you can take that as a tool and you can practice it, because it's a skill. You can practice that skill. When you hear maybe even criticism, turn it around and say, no, that's not a criticism. That's actually a compliment.
Most definitely, yeah.
So, Allyson, where can people find you? What are you up to? What are your projects,
Easiest way to find me is the website, www.evolutionarytherapies.com. And currently I'm revving up for a couple more speaking engagements. New Zealand again in October, which super excited about, the Ancestral Health Society of New Zealand. Hopefully some appearances at our local Ancestral Health Society as well. And then finishing up with the Functional Medicine Masters and integrating that into practice in pediatrics. So it'll be a busy spring, I think.
How much longer do you have?
6 months.
I have 140 days. Not that I'm counting.
But who's counting?
Who's counting?
You were right
Hey,
on
have fun, guys. You're in the home stretch, Allyson.
There you go. Exactly. We're knocking on that door, Guillermo.
What about you, Aaron? How can people find you? And talk a little bit about the upcoming AHS.
Oh, so I'm just all over the place on the internet, I guess. I don't know why. But I guess because you start the AHS and all of a sudden your name pops up in places. Anyway, the easiest way to find me is Google my name, Aaron Blaidsdell. I think I'd be the first one to come up. Add UCLA to it, or add pigeon, because I study pigeons as well, or add rat to that. And I'll definitely come up first, my animal lab stuff, because you'll see a lot about my animal lab research on animal cognition. That's what I play with. That's for my living. And the Ancestral Health Symposium this year, it's going to happen, and we're just narrowing in on a location. And so we don't know where it's going to be yet, but I think by next week we'll be picking that. And I'm on the board, so I haven't heard the which final place is for consideration. But I think by next week we should know.
That's awesome.
There's a lot of momentum online. Lots of people are awaiting that announcement with bated breath, I think.
It's going to be announced. It'll be soon. It'll be very soon. I can promise you it'll be very soon, because I know we narrowed the list down to like 3 places, and I believe that by next week we're going to have to pick the one, because we need to start planning it. So
cool.
Super exciting.
Yeah, I need to get off. Yeah, I need to get off my ass and submit my submission.
Yes, I want to see both of you there.
I would love it.
We'll be there. Yeah. Okay. One final question. Okay. Have you guys read your Rate My Professor ratings?
Not years.
No, I did when I first started teaching, and I was like, "Oh hell no, that's just gonna ruin everything." I base mine on the feedback the students give through the university, and I use that as my form of.
Yeah, I do the same as you, Allison. I just the ones that are sanctioned by the university, because then you get the entire sample.
Exactly. Not the outliers, who tend to be the ones that go online on Radio Professor.
Exactly. The ones that want to either rave about you or tear you to pieces. You only get
exactly.
those types.
I just want to know if you guys have chili peppers next to your name.
Well, that would be new, because last time I looked, I didn't have any chili peppers.
I don't even know what that means.
Uh-oh.
That's too funny.
Okay, guys. This has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you for coming to the show, and I will see you at AHS, and I'll continue looking for your publications, Aaron, and for all your work, Allison. And thank you for being here, and it was just such a great show.
Absolutely a pleasure. Thanks, Guillermo.
Thank you.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Guillermo. This is fun.